Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Preservation Resource Center's live class for today, June 9th. Thank you to everyone for coming back. We apologize for last week's technical difficulties, but we are ready to learn about the U.S. Custom House. And so just, before we get started, I want to make my usual pitch. Thank you so much to our members. If you're not a member of the PRC yet, please do consider joining. That's what keeps us able to do this programming. You can become a member at prcno.org. You can also get incredible merchandise there, like our coffee table book and our t-shirts. So please consider supporting the PRC and the programming that we are able to bring to you with your donations. So without further ado, I want to introduce John Klingman, who is a professor emeritus of architecture at Tulane University. He's an incredible scholar and architect and an expert on the U.S. Customs House. And he is going to tell us all about it today. John, take it away.
Thanks, Serena. Welcome to everybody. And I apologize also for the last week situation in which I gave a presentation for about an hour to myself. So anyway, this time I'm going to share it with you all. The Custom House is a really important building. It's one of the most important buildings in the southern part of the United States, arguably, I think, one of the most important federal buildings in the United States. And I'm going to explain why as we go through the building. So the Custom House, unfortunately, is not well known even by the citizens of New Orleans. I've had people come and tell me that the only time, people of my generation tell me the only time they were ever in the Custom House is when they went for their draft physical. And so that doesn't have pleasant associations with many people. Since then, I have been working for a long period of time with Waggonner and Ball Architects. As you can see here, 7 projects from 1986 through 2007 to try to do some understanding of the building and some renovation and restoration of the building. I'm going to take you through some of that work right now. And I'm a little bit frustrated because even with all that work right now, the building is not very friendly to the public. So maybe that's a good reason to see the presentation in this format rather than directly in a physical way. So the Custom House is actually at one corner of the French Quarter in New Orleans. At the other corner, the downriver corner, is the U.S. Mint by William Strickland that was designed about 12 years earlier than the Custom House. So the Custom House at the time, in the 1840s, was a very monumental and important building. Now, at that time, the bulk of the U.S. Treasury's income came from tariffs. In fact, before the income taxes were established in the early part of the 20th century, 90% of the federal government's revenue came from tariffs. So custom houses were important because that's where the ship captains came and declared their cargo and paid their tariffs. Now, as you can see, the Custom House, its location on the Mississippi, well, it's close to the Mississippi, and the land between the Custom House and the river was all staging area for the ships in the 19th century. There were no buildings there. It was all open land where the ships would dock along the river, parallel to the river, and then unload their cargo in a stretch that went for miles along the Mississippi River. So the Custom House would have been the first building, the first major building that people saw when they got off their ship at the port of New Orleans. So I want to show you a little bit about the chronology of the building because it's very complex and long. An architect named A.T. Wood designed the building. He was approved by the Treasury Department in 1847. The building construction started in 1848, a year later. Now, Wood was not the most prominent architect in New Orleans at the time. In fact, he was a rather lesser known architect, I would say. The major architects in New Orleans at the time were James Bacon and James Gallier. They both sent drawings and models of a proposed custom house to the Treasury Department in Washington. But Wood, instead of sending stuff, he sent himself. So he went to Washington and sat outside of the Secretary of the Treasury's office for a long time until eventually he convinced them to award the commission to him. And they awarded to Wood because of several reasons, which I'll explain in a minute. So Wood was, the project was controversial right from the beginning because the building was so big. James Dakin criticized the project extensively. And a year later, he got himself, or 3 years later, in 1850, he got himself appointed the supervising architect, and Wood was fired. Wood then lobbied against Dakin, and a year later, Dakin was fired because the changes that he proposed were too radical. And Wood got hired back in, but then he also was working with another New Orleans architect, Lewis Reynolds, who came from New York to work on the Custom House. Reynolds didn't last for too long. Wood died of yellow fever in 1854, and that was the same year that G.T. Beauregard, the later Confederate general, was appointed the superintendent. Beauregard was a West Point engineer, and so he had a lot of managerial and engineering skill, and it turns out he was quite an important superintendent in the building as it was being built from 1854 until 1860, when Beauregard resigned because of the Civil War. In 1857, a set of drawings was issued by the Treasury Department, including Wood's plans, but also some detail sheets done by the architects of the Treasury Department. In 1860, an Englishman, Thomas K. Wharton, who came to New Orleans, was appointed superintendent. He had been working on the building as an assistant since 1852. The post office, the main post office of New Orleans, opened in 1860 on the ground floor. In 1862, construction was suspended. The Custom House became the headquarters for the U.S. Army and prisoner of war holding facility. Construction didn't resume until 1870 under the supervision of Alfred D. Mullett, the supervising architect of the Treasury Department. The building was completed in 1881. It was electrified in 1886. The elevators were installed in the lobby until 1901. In 1916, the first Treasury Department renovation occurred as the post office and federal courts moved out of the building to Lafayette Square. It was a terrible renovation, as I'll show you in a little while. In 1940, a freight elevator was added in the southeast stair. Air conditioning was introduced into the marble hall. And in 1978 renovation, local firm Mathis Bergman did new elevators, air conditioned the offices, and installed a lot of suspended ceilings within the building. So let's look at it from the outside first. Here's a view looking toward Jackson Square, looking downriver, and you can see the river-facing elevation of the Custom House. The exterior of the Custom House is built of Quincy granite, enormous amount of granite. The granite's about 18 inches thick. The exterior walls are about 5 feet thick at the base. This is a bearing wall building, not only at the exterior walls, but also their interior brick bearing walls. So this building has no columns, no frame. It's a wall structure. And as such, it's a very heavy and massive building. So here you can see the elevation as designed by A.T. Wood. This is his elevation drawing on the left. There's a little section through the building. And you'll notice that for a 19th century building, this building is quite simple. And that was one of the things that the Treasury Department liked about Wood's design, that the simplicity of the building denoted a kind of, what would you say, not ostentatious or elaborate, so that the federal government was not wasting the taxpayers' money. They were doing something that was very straightforward. And here's the building from the Decatur Street side, the side facing the Lake Pontchartrain. Here's the building from Iberville, the side facing the French Quarter. And you'll notice that, in fact, the building's elevation idea is the same on all 4 sides. And this caused some very complicated planning inside, as we'll see in a minute. So this is looking up. The most elegant and interesting architectural piece on the exterior of the building are these fabulous Egyptian-esque columns and the column capitals, which are just amazing. I've looked at a lot of Egyptian architecture, and I haven't found column capitals that precisely look like this. I found some things that look fairly close, but if anybody has seen a column capital that looks exactly like this, I would be very interested in seeing it. Now, the building's complex history is shown right here, in that you'll notice there's a color difference between what happens at the column and below, which is Quincy granite, and what happens above, which is a cast iron cornice. So this is an image from 1860 when the building was partially occupied, but there was no roof on the building and there was no cornice on the building. And at that time, the building was settling rather substantially. According to records, the building has settled about 3 feet, and that the designers, when they resumed construction in 1870, were afraid to put any more weight on the building than was absolutely necessary. So the cornice that you're seeing is actually a hollow cast iron cornice, which looks massive, but it doesn't weigh very much because it's all empty inside. And that was one of their ways of reducing the weight on the building. We'll see some other ways that they reduce the weight of the building in a minute. Now, if you look at the image on your left, you'll notice the simplicity of the exterior wall treatment. It's almost modern in its notation. If you look at the right, you'll see that the first floor of the building is rusticated. That means it has those shadow lines that are included in the stone. And it also demonstrates one of the two myths that's associated with the custom house, which is this niche. And you'll notice that the niche doesn't have anything in it, it's empty. And the rumor is that there were going to be statues in the niches, but the Yankees stole the statues and took them away. And that's why the building has no niches. In fact, the niches were not designed to hold statues. They were designed to be architectural ornament, just the way they are. So the other myth about the custom house is that the foundation is cotton bales. And that may have to do with cotton bales used around the perimeter of the excavation for dewatering when the foundations were made. If you look at the bottom of the section, you'll see that the foundation is actually what's called a cypress grillage. It's a mat of cypress logs, 12 inches by 12 inches, that were set at cross layers to one another. And so the building is sitting on this gigantic mat of cypress. And as long as the cypress is below the water table, it's stable and it won't rot. And in fact, that's been the situation. So the other aspect that you can see in this drawing is that connecting the foundations were inverted masonry bearing arches. And these arches spread the load so that when the building settled, it settled uniformly rather than differentially, which means that there are no cracks. So even though the building has settled a lot, it hasn't suffered structural distress. I'll call your attention to one other aspect of the section, and that is this enormous cupola over the center of the building, which was also abandoned after the Civil War because of the concerns about the weight of the building. So now we're going to look at the plans of the building and go inside. You're seeing here the AT wood drawings of the first and second floor from the 1857 set. First floor below, second floor above. First floor was post office on the left, building services on the riverside on the right, and storage in the middle. And the second floor was this gigantic room. So what we'll do is we'll go up from the Canal Street lobby and walk into the giant room. So here we are, we've just entered the building. You can see we're being drawn upward by a large skylight. And that's leading us up the stairs rather than through the opening in the center of the stairs. So we go up the stairs and then we see we're in this kind of large lobby, which originally was marbleized, we found out. But that would probably be too much for the 21st century. So it's just painted a historic color. The columns in the lobby are cast iron and the details are shown precisely the way the building was built in the 1857 drawing. So we know that these were the original intention of A.T. Wood's drawings. There's some lovely ornament within the lobby, including this great light fixture with a designation of U.S. Treasury cut into the stone below the fixture. And then here it is from the lobby looking across, you can see the skylight. When we started working on the building, that skylight was being lit by fluorescent lights. Skylights always leak, so usually, quite frequently, skylights get turned into plywood, and then electric light substitutes for natural light, but of course they have nothing to do with one another. We were able to lobby GSA to put the skylight back, and so this is the space above the lobby ceiling, but below the roof. Those hangers that you see with the different colored wood at the base are the location of the original elevators, which were cages in the lobby and went up through there. And when they were removed, you can see how the wood and glass ceiling was put back into space. There's our new skylight, letting daylight into the building. That's a detail of the skylight. So now we're going to visit the main general business room of the building, and it's known as the Marble Hall. And you'll see why in a second. Now, there's a dilemma that occurred as the result of Wood's planning. Wood proposed 4 equal elevations. Each elevation was supposed to have a main entrance in the center of it, and each entrance was to have a monumental stair that came up to the 2nd floor. Well, because the site is not square, in fact, the site is a trapezoid, this made the planning quite difficult. Now, if you think about it, there are not very many buildings that have 4 fronts and no sides. In fact, the Villa Rotunda comes to mind, Palladio's great building from the 16th century. There are not many. So, and when you have a building with 4 fronts and 4 lobbies, you get into trouble. And here you can see the dilemma. Well, what happened was, okay, first, the reason that Wood wanted 4 fronts was because the city of New Orleans in the 1840s was deeply divided politically. The French people didn't want to have anything to do with the Americans, but they were an important constituency. So the Americans had their locus of government on the other side of Canal Street. Canal Street's at the bottom in this plan. So the Canal Street entrance was important to the Americans. The French Quarter was to the top of this plan, so that Iberville Street was important. But also the river entrance was important because that's where the ship captains would come to pay their duty. And then the other entrance onto Decatur Street on the left-hand side was really more for the post office than for anything else. Well, it turns out that the 2 entrances on the riverside and the lakeside were never completed inside. The stairs were never built. The stairs were built on the Canal Street side. Canal Street then became the main entrance to the building, but the Marble Hall had already been planned and designed. And so here you can see that the entrance access from Canal Street actually doesn't correspond with the center of this great room, but the entrance access from the river does. So the building never had a stairway from the riverside up to the room, but the room is designed as though the principal entrance is from that side. So this is what you see when you're looking at the building, when you've entered from the riverside of the building. You see this perfectly symmetrical, amazing Greek Revival space, 100 and some feet long, 55 feet to the glass ceiling, just an absolutely remarkable space. The columns are probably the preeminent feature. The marble came from Italy. It was shipped in blocks to Boston. In Boston, the blocks were carved into cylinders and shipped to New Orleans. The capitals are Vermont marble, which was carved in Boston and then also shipped to New Orleans. The columns were fluted in place, which is really quite common in classical architecture. They were fluted when the construction resumed after the Civil War. For a while during the Civil War, this room was open to the sky, if you can imagine that. At the top of the columns are, each side has an important element of local interest. Tobacco, cotton, and the heads of 2 figures, Mercury, the god of business, and Luna, the goddess of the moon, who is connected with the crescent city, the crescent moon, New Orleans, Crescent River. So those are the associations that the capitals have with the specifics of the city. Now, the room itself was always used as an office, and the ship captains would come up to these beautiful mahogany windows and declare their cargo and pay their duty. And the room functioned that way from the time that the building opened until the early part of the 21st century, when security concerns following 9/11 changed the way that the ship captains and the customs people interacted. Although my understanding now is that the ship captains do come to the custom house, but unfortunately they don't come to this room anymore. In fact, this room is empty. There's no life to it. It's used as a party space intermittently, and sometimes it's used as an event space, but not frequently. enough to really give it any sense of life, which is a real shame because of the importance, both architecturally and also, I guess, programmatically, of this particular function of the federal government, and it needs to be a public space. So if you look above the ceiling in that room, you can go up into the attic and you can see these windows below the skylights. And you'll notice to the left of this image that there are a bunch of hand cranks. The hand cranks allow these windows in a kind of butterfly mechanism to be opened. And there you can see during the restoration in the Marble Hall after Katrina, some of those ceiling windows opened. And that, of course, would allow the room to become a giant chimney, which would help with ventilation of the building. That was an important concern because the mass of this building, the volume of this building is so great. In fact, there was only the Capitol of the United States was a larger building at the time this building was constructed, and the Capitol is a thinner building. So one of Dakin's concerns was the gigantic interior volume. He wanted to move the Marble Hall to the Canal Street face of the building after the building was already in construction. And clearly you can see that that would cause enormous amounts of consternation. That's the reason that he only lasted for a year as the supervising architect of the building. So this is the original proposal for the cupola above the Marble Hall. These are the 1857 drawings. If you look inside the Marble Hall, you'll see that the elevation is almost precisely what's built, although what's above it is not. What's above it is what's shown in this Waggonner and Ball drawing from the 90s, which is a much simpler shed roof condition that provided for a reduction in the mass and weight of the building. You can also see a very unusual aspect of the building in this image, which is that the roof pitch, instead of extending from the middle of the building to the outer edge, which is common in almost every building to shed water, the roofs on the top floor of the building, the fourth floor, actually shed inward toward the roof of the Marble Hall, which is taller. And of course, this is complicated because of drainage issues, but it further reduced the mass of the building, and that's why they did it that way. The first project that I got involved in this building was to study the top floor, these wonderful, weird attic spaces, for potential conversion into office use. Now, at the time the custom house was built, it was built with the top floor to be storage. And the idea was that if people didn't pay their duty, or if they were bringing in illegal contraband, the customs people would confiscate the goods and bring it to the custom house and take it through the carriageways. And there are hoistways in each corner of the building, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you look, you'll see little rectangles in each area of each quadrant of the building. And those were open spaces that were to allow goods to be hauled up to the fourth floor to be kept there. So the idea of changing that into office space was pretty interesting. It had never been occupied space since the building was instituted. So we found it to be fascinating. So we went up and did a survey of the top floor. It was kind of a mess. Coast Guard had been up there for a while. There was a lot of debris, a lot of old government storage. It was almost spooky. Here you can see the beautiful original windows looking out toward Canal Street in the image on your right. You can also see pieces of the exterior granite that weren't even trimmed on the fourth floor because they didn't figure it was finished space. But the spaces are gorgeous. And they have these fabulous trusses that have wood double top cords and cast steel diagonals and bottom cords, some of which are doubled. And they're very, very light, very, very strong, and extremely beautiful. So we felt like this would make great space. All you'd have to do would be organize some services, and you could put people up in there. And ultimately, that actually occurred, not under our watch, but a few years ago, all those spaces were finished out. The corridors were more complicated because on the fourth floor, the corridors were encumbered with what we called skylight boxes. The skylight boxes were installed in the 1916 renovation to prevent the upward spread of smoke and fire. So they were a fire safety device, but they also caused some real problems in circulation on the fourth floor So we made some proposals to mitigate that circumstance. And this is from one of our documents, the site survey for the fourth floor attic study. On the left-hand side, you can see my uh, history of the corridor around the marble hall, where maybe it was outdoor space at first, then it was all open, then it had skylight boxes in the third image, and then the final was our proposal, which you can see enlarged in the image on the right, which was to modify the roof of the corridor to raise it up so that it connected to the roof of the marble hall, and then put a little glass box underneath to prevent the spread of fire. And so conceptually, that would look like this. You can see in red the change that was proposed, and in fact has been carried out. So here's a little sketch that I did that would show that what that might be like. And then here you can see the new roof coming in above the old roof. We left the beams of the old roof so you could see what the old roof structure was. But then above that, this is original condition along Canal Street. There it is once the roof has been changed and the skylight added. And there you can see it again. Isn't that great? So it really gives enough space for added utilities, also makes that space feel a lot lighter, and it makes a new condition, but it also respects the original historic condition and leaves elements that show what that is. Now, these are the loft spaces, and they're just so beautiful. Here you can see in the background, in the distance, a pipe, and that funny pipe is a post-Katrina effort to provide an escape route for water. During Katrina, the Canal Street storm sewers backed up and the custom house roof collapsed after 6 feet of water was stranded on that roof surface. So this pipe is to guarantee that that doesn't happen again. There you can see how it looks. From the inside, it's kind of awkward. I think it should have been designed probably much more carefully. This is the way it looks on the outside. That little round thing is the emergency escape water route. Again, I think it probably could have been done a little bit better, but it's fairly unobtrusive. So these are what the spaces look like now. There were all these openings, these low segmented arches are original. Many of them had been closed up, and so we proposed reopening them. So in fact, you can look along the entire 300 and some foot length of the Canal Street facade. This is afternoon with the afternoon sun coming in through those openings, just absolutely gorgeous space. Now those offices are all filled up with tenants and they're no longer capable of being visited because of security reasons. The next project that we got involved in is stair circulation in the building. If you were going to occupy the top floor, then you'd have to have pretty good egress. And in fact, during the 1916 renovation, some horrible things happened to stairs inside the building. The 1916 Treasury people thought the building wasn't efficient enough. So in the Iberville stair, which was a double stair, they took out half of it and put offices in the stairwell. I mean, just absolutely insane. And so one of the things we did was we put the stair back. We put the second stair back and restored it. The other aspect of this image is that you can see at the bottom of the stair are checkerboard 1x1 black and white marble tiles, which originally covered the circulation in the entire building. But again, in 1916, they were all removed in order to be replaced with terrazzo, which is not nearly as elegant, I think. Another bad idea from 1916, which would be wonderful to overturn. So here are our studies for stairs in the custom house. And this is for the number of people that could use each stair for egress. We ended up on the option 3, the lower left, where we've decided to design a new stair that replaced a historic stair in the southwest quadrant of the building, the lower left corner of the building. So that became an interesting design challenge. We also took the opportunity to restore the southeast stair by getting rid of the freight elevator and making it a legal stair. So here are those two things. On the left, you're seeing the Iberville stair with the new run of the stair being ready for installation on the right-hand part of that image. And on the right image, you're seeing the new freight elevator location. So what we did was we got rid of the freight elevator that was in this stair. because we had read a newspaper article from the 1870s about what an amazing, fabulous stair this was. But once it had a freight elevator in the middle, you couldn't even see it anymore. So anyway, we got rid of the freight elevator, gave Customs a bigger freight elevator, which they were happy with. And this is what we got in return. We got an open stairwell. And there it is during restoration. The plaster was failing, so it's been removed. And then subsequently, the plaster was put back on. There's a mahogany railing, which we added because the newspaper article in 1875 said they were going to put a mahogany railing on. And so we completed that project for them. The stairs look as though they're cantilevered. They actually extend back into the brick wall by 8 inches. If you look at the image here, you can see that there's a kind of a granite piece that is toothed into the brick. The stair tread changes shape as it enters into the wall, and that's how the stair is able to be self-supporting. Here's what it looks like now with the plaster back on, just incredibly elegant. So I had a sort of epiphany. I was visiting some other custom houses a few years ago, and I was taken to the one in New Bedford, Mass. From 1836, Robert Mills. Look at the stair detail. It's exactly the same. Exactly the same. So I think this was probably a standard federal U.S. Treasury detail. Here's the New Bedford stair, though. It's not nearly as elegant because the stairwell is much smaller than it is in the New Orleans custom house. So on to the new stair. So the new stair ended up being quite an interesting endeavor, and I led the design on this particular aspect of the project. My idea was to have the stair that was the opposite of everything that was custom house. So instead of it being heavy and massive, it was light, it's freestanding, it's held up by 4 sets of double angles in the interior of the stairwell. So it only touches the exterior wall at the very edges to prevent it from swaying in the breeze. And how did we do it? Well, the way that we did it was in the image on the left, we cut through these gigantic vaults. Now, these masonry vaults on the first 2 floors of the building, they're groin vaults, they're solid brick. In the middle where you can see that hole is about 18 inches in depth. And at the perimeter, at the spring line of the vault, that is about 6 feet in thickness. It's just an amazing amount of masonry. We asked our structural engineer, Ashton Avegno, whether we could cut out for the stair, and he said, yes, as long as we cut out a full vault, it would be structurally stable. We just couldn't cut out part of the vault. So that actually gave us a big stairwell for a fire stair, which we were ended up being pretty happy about. In the image on the right here, you can see that when you cut away a vault, you end up with an arch. So that's what we had. This shows the holes being cut all the way through the building. What you're seeing in the distance there is the roof, the plywood at the roof, where we're installing a new skylight at the top of the stair because all the stairs originally had skylights. This is the hole in the 4th floor. That's looking down at this enormously messy undertaking of cutting this gigantic opening all the way from the ground to the roof of the building. So here's the steel stair being inserted. You can see the lightness, the lightweight of it, and then it's going to be plastered inside. You can see them furring out for the plaster. Here's what it looks like now. It's, I think, one of the really interesting contrasts between the 19th century work and what we would do in the late 20th or early 21st centuries, and I'm really happy with it. Even the risers are open, they're steel mesh rather than solid, so that it emphasizes the lightness of the construction, which you can see again here when you look all the way up through the stair, which connects up to the top of the skylight. I was taking people through the building, which I often have done in the past, and the GSA guy who was walking around with us looked at me afterwards and said, I've been working in this building for, I don't remember what he said, 5 years, 10 years. He said, I've never been in that stair before, because of course everybody uses the elevator. So it's just kind of frustrating sometimes to see how the building is being used. So now we're going to go to the 1st floor, and we did a tremendous amount of work in restoring essentially the entire 1st floor, which was a mess. The post office is on the left. In the middle, below the marble hall, they called it an open storage room. And in fact, of course, as you can imagine, it's now the boiler room. You can see the 4 stairs that were shown in the original wood proposal. Again, only 2 of them were built, the one at the bottom of the plan and the one at the top of the plan. And those X's that you're seeing in the plan are the groin vaults. So it's just the same kind of construction that you would have seen in the Gothic cathedrals of the Middle Ages. Now, the next image here is the boiler house, not surprising. But what is surprising and really problematic was that the first floor was essentially used as an on-grade basement. So these fabulous carriageways with wonderful arches and vaults were encumbered with dozens of pipes that were going longitudinally through the building and then rising up at various points to the upper floors in the building. And our goal was to restore the carriageways to their original use, which meant we had to get all those pipes out of there. In the image on the right, you're seeing what we call a cross carriageway. There's a little bit of bluestone paving right near the gate, which is original, by the way. And that paving, that stone paving, covered all the carriageways, and it's all gone. And the carriageways turned into asphalt, and somehow all that stone disappeared. I have no idea. I think it's probably around New Orleans somewhere, but I have no idea where it ended up going. So the carriageway system was the way in which goods were going to come in and then be hoisted up. So at one point, they even proposed a railroad, and this is a plan with the railroad, where the goods would come in maybe on the riverside or at the through the gates on the Iberville or the Canal Street side, and then be transported longitudinally to the hoistways and hoisted up into the building. As far as we know, that system was never, the rail system was never carried out. But the spaces in the ground floor were pretty interesting. Now, this is the corner space with that rounded corner on the river side of the building. And if you look at the paint line about halfway up in this space, you'll see this unbelievable story where in the 1978 renovation, a suspended ceiling was put in about 9 feet above the floor, and everything above that paint line was invisible because of the pipes and ducts that the architects were unwilling to let people look at. And so in order to avoid seeing the pipes and ducts, you didn't get to see the fabulous structure either. So these are construction photos as we're moving things out of the carriageway. So what we ended up doing was taking all of those pipes that were in the carriageway and putting them under the ground. And that's why you're seeing this big pile of dirt. So that's all excavated so that utilities could go under the ground rather than above the vaults in that first floor. We also opened up the original openings, which align actually all the way up the building. Many of them had been closed off, or some of them had been lowered. We found some original details like the gate in the image on the left, or the transoms in the cast iron transoms in the image on the right. Here, the worker is taking out a lowering of the original archway. So all these openings are the same size. They're all 8 feet wide and I think 13 feet high. We found one room on the first floor, the only room in the building where the vault is not plastered. The brick is exposed, and so we left it exposed, of course. It's just amazing. It's also kind of amazing when you think about it, because of the trapezoidal plan, none of these rooms are square or rectangular. They don't have right angles. They all have 4 sides, but they don't have right angles. And somehow the vault makers, the masons, were able to cope with that. And here's the carriageway as it's getting all the utilities taken out of it and being plastered. And here's the final, in the right, the carriageway is completed, the restoration is completed. Now, we were hopeful that this part of the first floor would get a public use, and Audubon Institute expressed interest, and so GSA had public hearings. I supported Audubon having access to this space. I thought it was a great way to get the public into the building. Unfortunately, Audubon's designers were kind of like cartoonists, 3-dimensional cartoonists, and they made this part of the custom house into a cartoon of jungle and giant insects and rotting buildings and completely obliterated the architecture that we had spent so much time and energy and resources in restoring. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. Subsequently, we restored the west side, the other side of the first floor. And in order to do that, we had to go into the office spaces, which at the time were the Drug Enforcement Administration's little cubicles. And we had to go above the ceilings to see what was still there. And it turned out, as you can see in this image, everything was still there. So here I am sticking my head above the ceiling and taking pictures of the vaults, which we were going to try to uncover. That's what the offices looked like thanks to the 1978 renovation, just absolutely generic office space. And here's what we were trying to do. So in the post office, we were taking an original condition, which you can see in the upper diagram here. Public is entering from the left along the entire length of the street. What are now windows were all multiple doorways. The stair that's shown in the middle, remember, was never constructed. So in fact, that post office is one gigantic room, which is over 300 feet long, 3 sets of groin vaults. It's just an unbelievable space. And then in the back of that, in the upper diagram, you can see that gray bar is the line of post office, postal carriers corridor. The post office was completely separated from the rest of the building. There were originally no openings in the wall between the post office and the rest of the custom house. It was completely independent. The middle zone shows the middle diagram shows the work zone in light gray, and then the offices for the postmaster and assorted bureaucrats on either end of the building. And then the lower plan shows what we found in our work to restore the post office. The dark thing near Canal Street in the lower plan is a vault. It's called a sub-treasury vault. It was installed in 1916. It is 12 inches of cast-in-place reinforced concrete with double layers of reinforcing in order to hold millions of dollars in treasury money, and I think gold perhaps as well. So this thing was an enormous encumbrance on our proposal to restore the space. We had an estimate done. It turned out it would cost $3 million just to take that thing out. And of course, GSA didn't want to do it, but eventually they did. And so the vault got removed. That's it on the left-hand image, just an absolutely massive, horrible thing. And then in the right, you can see partitions starting to come out, plaster being removed, and the original fabric of the building being uncovered. So this is probably my favorite image in this whole collection, which shows the unbelievable monumentality and grace of this space. It's just one of the best spaces, certainly in New Orleans. I think probably one of the best 19th century spaces in the United States, and it deserves to be a public space. So after Katrina, I was trying to get the public library interested in maybe making it a branch library. Of course, they didn't have any money. Could be a gallery, could be a museum, although we already have a whole bunch of museums, but it needs to be something public. Eventually, GSA simply gave up on trying to find a tenant for it, and it's now an office space for customs. So it's really not an appropriate use of this amazing monumental public space for offices. And of course, the offices have security as a major concern, so the public cannot even get in to look at this space. You can only see it from walking by on the street. Here's what it was looking like. Temporary light fixtures, sprinkler lines exposed toward the end of the restoration. So just one more little history of the building. And this has to do with post-Katrina work. As I mentioned, the ceilings collapsed with water damage during Katrina, so a lot of plaster was damaged. Fortunately, there was no structural damage, but a lot of plaster had to be redone. So the building was emptied of people for several years after Katrina, so that a major restoration of the middle floors of the building could be undertaken. And that was undertaken in a fairly straightforward way. Ultimately, Waggonner and Ball were no longer the architects for the building, and a couple of Texas firms came in and completed the work in, I would say, a rather generic sort of historicist fashion. Oh, one more thing in this image. if you look at the ceiling, those little curlicue things are called volutes, and they're sort of a classical uh, ornamental element. They were installed in the building as part of the 1916 renovation because the Treasury people at that time felt the building was too plain. So they put these horrible classical things in. They really need to be removed, and I hope someday they will be. So there's the corridor condition. There's the, I'm going to kind of summarize my talk at this point. So the, this is what the offices looked like on the middle floors of the building when I first started visiting it, which is that when you look through, you just saw generic office space, hung ceilings, just the most, banal possible. When above that, there's another 5 or 8 feet of fabulous structure. And then this is what you see kind of once you take some of that junk out. And again, if you look at where the paint line is, you can see all that, everything that's in lime green was above the suspended ceiling at one point for dozens of years. So in the future, I think some things need to happen to this building to make it again feel like it is a building that can be embraced and should be embraced by the public. But that's not really the only issue with the Custom House, because meanwhile, across Canal Street, there have been 2 proposals for gigantic high-rise hotels above what are called the Sandlin buildings, which are very historic 19th century buildings owned by free people of color. Fortunately, in both cases, the PRC has raised the alarm, and neither of the proposals for high-rise hotels was successful. This one is the first proposal, as the newspaper article is showing here, and you can see what an absolutely hideous building this would have been from 1996. Thank God it didn't occur. So for now, the Custom House is kind of safe from this, but I think we always have to be vigilant. And the reason we have to be vigilant is just look at this location. Custom House is right at ground zero of New Orleans tourism. There's Canal Place, which is the shopping mall to the right of the building. Just below it, the Custom House is kind of pointing at a hideous Harrah's Casino, which is a tourist attraction. You can see giant hotels on Canal Street a block away. So Custom House is in a position where millions of people walk by this building every year. And so the building needs to find a way to tell the story of itself and welcome people to see what an amazing structure it is. So I'm kind of going out of my role here as commentator, and I'm going to close with some recommendations to the GSA to make this building a more important part of American architectural history. So first, I think the GSA should consider this building as a preeminent work of American architecture and not as real estate or as office space, as a number one way of thinking about it. I think the Marble Hall has to be restored to a business use. In fact, when Woods plans, he calls it the Central Business Room. That was its title. And it needs to have a program. An empty room that's just used for parties or movies is not a real space. So Marble Hall has to be restored to its historic use. First floor east, what could go there when the insectarium comes out? I think maybe a bookstore. Some of you probably know about Powell's in Portland, Oregon, which is this enormous used bookstore in downtown with dozens of rooms. I mean, that kind of thing for the carriageway and eastern spaces would be good. Unfortunately, the carriageway was air conditioned during the insectarium era, and I think it should not be air conditioned. The spaces off the carriageway can be individually air conditioned, but the carriageway really needs to be an outdoor space as it was originally conceived. On the other side of the first floor, that original main post office for New Orleans needs to be a public space somehow. And I don't know what the program is, but I think, and I hope, that everybody who sees this presentation might think what a possible program for that space should be. It certainly can't be just offices for federal office workers. And then one of the fourth floor spaces needs to be opened up. Maybe it's a museum of the building so that people can get in and see what those spaces are like. Right now, you can't get into any of them because they all have tenants. And then finally, and very importantly, I think the public should be encouraged to access and have interface with this building. It's just an amazing, absolutely amazing building, and it's a tragedy that so few people are able to encounter it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and then see if there are any comments or questions from anybody who is online, and also I'll turn it back over to Serena.
Thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A section, and I will make sure to get the questions to John.
Serena, is there anything that struck you while you were listening?
Well, I want to thank you for shouting out the PRC, as always, for our advocacy work. So that was lovely. You know, I always like, just at the end just now, you were talking about not wanting to air condition the carriageway of the building. And I'm always really interested in sort of how modern building systems interact with these historic buildings. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of why that does or doesn't work in a space like this or in different spaces from that era?
Well, it's very complicated. And the reason it's complicated has to do with condensation. That what happens in New Orleans is we quite typically, like today, like right now, have a very high dew point, which means the relative humidity is high. And if a surface is cold, then water will condense out of the air onto that surface. And what air conditioning does is it produces cold surfaces. And so the interface between an air-conditioned surface and the warm, moist air in New Orleans presents problems. Now, these problems can be dealt with, but they have to be carefully considered to begin with. So that's the first condition. The second condition is has to do with the degree of infiltration between the exterior and the interior of the buildings. And historically, these buildings were all designed to breathe. And so there were lots of ways in which air could find its way between inside and outside, even in a building as massive as the Custom House. Once you start air conditioning, then the desire of the engineers is always to minimize that interaction between warm, humid exterior air and cool, drier, air-conditioned space. And again, it's the interface between those two conditions that causes an opportunity for condensation. Once water condenses on a surface, then that surface is a great home for mold or mildew, or if it's an edible condition, for insects. And so it presents a very challenging circumstance. So my argument tends to be to minimize air conditioning as much as possible, rather than to maximize air conditioning as much as possible. And of course, that also has huge implications for our energy use, and particularly our future with respect to global climate change and something called the urban heat island effect, which is that cities tend to be up to 10 degrees warmer in warm weather than the surrounding countryside because of the density of air conditioning and heated surfaces and impervious surfaces as opposed to vegetation. So it's a very complicated and interesting and essential question, in fact.
All right, John, we have a bunch of questions here, so I'm going to try to get through as many of them as possible for everyone. So someone is saying they love the building's combination of Egyptian and Greek revival elements. Wondering if you have any idea what inspired Wood to hybridize the two, and or why it's not carried through to the interior.
Well, it's interesting. Around that time, and there are several architectural historians that are listening to this presentation, so I hope they will correct me. But around that time, there was a frenzy of interest in Egyptian architecture. So there were Egyptian-esque buildings being built in the northeastern part of the United States. And then, of course, there was always been, from the inception of the United States, there's always been a real fascination with Greek architecture, perhaps with the notions that Greek democracy and American democracy had some architectural as well as political resonance. And so I think that on the outside of the building, there's no Greek reference other than, well, not even the fluting in the columns, because the Egyptians did that also. But inside the building, there are a few Egyptianoid things. The interior surround of the front entrance door has a beautiful stone Egyptian piece. And the light fixtures in the lobby have American eagles holding up mummies. I mean, it's just amazing. But the rest of the interior is, as the viewer points out, a classic Greek revival condition. And that's carried out pretty completely in the interior spaces that have ornament.
Thank you. So are the majority of the windows original, or have they been replaced over the years?
Okay, so that's a good, in fact, you can see in this image, the top floor windows are 6/6. Those are original windows on the 4th floor. All the others have been replaced. And my feeling is that all the lower windows should also become multi-light windows. The glazing is pretty haphazard on the lower floors. I think all that stuff, none of that glazing is original. I think it should all be replaced. Also on the 1st floor, there were grills. There were metal grills, security bars, and we were able to argue in the age of 21st century technology for security that bars no longer made sense. So I believe all those bars have been removed. So that's a good thing, but it's a good question about the glazing. And fortunately, we know what the original windows are like by looking at the 4th floor windows, which are still in mostly pretty good shape.
Another question about the building materials. Someone's wondering why use Quincy granite for.
Oh, well, so Quincy granite was thought to be the highest quality granite in the United States. In fact, interestingly, I just learned this today by looking on the internet under Quincy granite, that a custom house at Savannah, Georgia, was begun exactly the same year as the U.S. Custom House in New Orleans. Guess what it's made of? Quincy granite. So I think that Quincy granite was a material of choice because of its high quality. Interestingly, you can see in this image, if you look at the stonework, the stonework looks as though it was put up a decade ago. I mean, there's absolutely no deterioration of the granite. It's just incredible that this stone has held up so well. And it's a real testament to the quality of the stone and also the quality of the masons who cut the stone and assembled it in these beautiful walls.
Thank you. So is the building stable now, or does it continue to sink?
Okay, so the building, after the completion of the building, the settlement slowed noticeably. And in 1926, a foundation excavation was done to see what the state of the foundations were. They found that the cypress grillage was completely intact with no signs of decay, and the building has stopped settling. Now, according to sources, the sources say the building has settled 3 feet and the canal street has been raised in elevation by 2 feet. Somehow that doesn't seem right. I think either one or the other may be true, but I doubt that both of them are true, because otherwise there would be just very strange conditions between the flooring inside the building, the flooring of the carriageways, which connects more or less at street elevation. So I would say the building had settled early on, several feet, and then after that it's stabilized, and it's been stable ever since. Thank goodness.
Great. Okay, so someone would like to know a little bit more about the roof design and sort of why that inverted, I guess, hipped roof was designed for the building, and what the drainage or leaking issues might have been that resulted from that.
Well, originally the shape of the roof, I think, just came from a desire to minimize the volume as much as possible. and again, to minimize the weight. It was a very bold and maybe rash thing to do, as Katrina ultimately demonstrated. But prior to that, there weren't too many problems. Originally, that roof was copper, and apparently within a couple of years, the copper was moving so much in the heat of the sun that the copper joints were failing and the roof was leaking. So they got rid of the copper, which must have been worth a fortune, and they used a more traditional flat roof system. Ultimately, the roof was, in fact, when we started working on the fourth floor, that roof was not even insulated. It was just those very light wood decking and roofing on top of it. Eventually, we got rigid insulation, which made a tremendous difference. The fourth floor also was not heated or cooled, by the way. It had no HVAC whatsoever. So, but as far as I know, once the roof was stabilized, leaking wasn't a problem until the flood of Katrina. What happened then was, in Canal Street, the storm drains backed up. And so when the storm drains backed up, the roof water had nowhere to go. So it just kept piling up in the water. And apparently the roof held 6 feet of water before it collapsed. So that's an awful lot of water. Now it's with these kind of extra pipes, it's been stabilized. But if you think about how much water gets on that roof is a full city block of New Orleans, where it might rain 2 inches, 3 inches, sometimes even 5 inches per hour. So it's an enormous amount of water that's collected on that roof.
John, someone's asking if you know anything about whether or not any slave trade actions or transactions occurred in this building, or sort of what the history of this building is with regard to that era of history.
No, the building was always controlled by the U.S. government. It was always, originally it was all U.S. government offices. So it was the federal courts, the federal post office, and customs. Those were the 3 major tenants. So there was nothing to do with slavery. Major slavery outpost, of course, was St. Louis Hotel in the Via Carré. The building was, though, immediately adjacent to the site of the 1874 riot that had to do with the end of Reconstruction in New Orleans. It happened just outside of the Custom House, and people may be familiar with that history, or you can look it up. But the Custom House was adjacent to the site of that. I believe it was called the Battle of Liberty Place. Absolutely reprehensible situation. And I will say one other thing about the Civil War, which is that when the Union captured New Orleans in 1862, Benjamin Butler, who was affectionately known as Spoons because supposedly he would steal all the spoons from the wealthy ladies of New Orleans, his office was on the 2nd floor of the Custom House. And at the same time, the Custom House was used as a prisoner of war facility for Confederate prisoners. Supposedly up to 2,000 people were quartered within that building for some time period, although that frankly seems pretty hard to believe. In the absence of historic photographs, who knows if to what degree that's actually true. But those are the only associations that I can think of that have to do with slavery or Civil War era conditions.
Thank you, John. Okay, we have a couple more questions that I'm going to try to answer. I know it's 1 o'clock, everyone, so if you need to go, I totally understand. But John, if you have a couple more minutes, people are very curious about this building. Sure. So someone wanted to know if, I guess they said that you said the building's supported by bearing walls, but obviously there are a lot of columns. Are all of the columns decorative, or are any of them supportive?
No, there are, in some places, the vaults frame into, I really call them pilasters or piers rather than columns. They're gigantic. They're about 5 feet by 5 feet on the ground floor. So they are columns, but it's so unusual to us as architects because we're so used to column grids, and this building has nothing like a column grid. In fact, in the east carriageway on the 1st floor, the vaults don't even line up with each other. It's absolutely amazing. but it doesn't matter because all of the structural forces are resolved within each bay of the building. So there doesn't have to be an overriding grid. So there are places where there are what you would call a column, but in most cases, you could really think of the columns as a small piece of a wall. And the bearing walls go all the way up from the interior bearing walls go all the way up from the foundation, many of them all the way up to and including the fourth floor.
Thank you. One more question about the stone, actually. Was the stone cut here in New Orleans, or was it cut at the quarry and then transported here?
Well, that's interesting, and I don't know the answer on the exterior granite. I do know that the Marble Hall stonework is more fully documented. And as I mentioned, the marble for the columns in the Marble Hall came from Italy in blocks, was sent to Boston. The column shapes were made in Boston. The column capitals were Vermont marble, which was carved in Boston. So the column capitals were already executed when they came to New Orleans. And the only thing that happened in the Marble Hall to the stonework is the columns were fluted in place, which is the way they were also done in classical times, apparently. As far as the exterior stone goes, I just don't know. It'd be very interesting to find out.
Is it common, someone's asking if it is common for custom houses to not be open to the public, or if this is a unique situation for this building?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of the historic custom houses in the United States have been transformed with adaptive reuse, either into showpieces, museums of various kinds. And so because of their historical importance. And I haven't really surveyed custom houses per se, so I'm not sure what their degree of openness is in a general way, but I do think that the department, when U.S. Customs became part of the Department of Homeland Security and the general hysteria that has occurred in this country since 2001, made what used to be a fairly simple process of getting into the building and walking around the building, a pretty easy and formal process, much more difficult and fraught, and to some degree even difficult to the point of impossibility. And I think it's very unfortunate for the way in which people and their federal government interact.
Okay, I think we have one more question. Someone's wondering if the GSA is involved in a tenant search, or if these are just sort of ideas that you have had on your own.
These are ideas I've had on my own. I mean, I've heard a rumor that the insectarium might be leaving Custom House, which then says, okay, what happens to that whole half of the first floor? I don't know if that in fact is true. It wouldn't surprise me at all, particularly after the current conditions that we're in. But I think that the recommendations that I'm making are personal at this point. They're just things that I've thought about because I fell in love with this building by working on it and by spending time in it over such a long period of time. I think it's a fabulous building, and it makes me so sad to see how much work and effort and expense have gone into trying to restore the building, and yet its visibility and its imageability to the American public is almost nil. And I just think that's a tragic condition and needs to be rectified.
Is it true that this was once a Confederate hospital?
Yes. Again, according to the literature, when the Confederates controlled New Orleans from the inception of the Civil War until Admiral Farragut's ships recaptured the city in 1862, which I guess would be what, a year and a half. It was the building was controlled by the Confederates, and I've read that it was a place where Union prisoners were held. I haven't heard anything about being a hospital, but that's certainly quite possible. but it was a relatively short period of time.
All right, I think that hits all of our questions for today. So I want to thank you for doing this again for us, John. This was fantastic. I really, really appreciate it, and we learned a ton today. So thank you everyone for coming. We will hopefully see you at the next one. We have a class on Friday to learn how to handle antique furniture restoration and reupholstery. And so hopefully we'll see you then. John, thank you. As always, it was a pleasure, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Bye, everyone.